teachers of Reddit. What is the best plot twist you didn't see coming in your students' writing? Teaching 8th grade English, a student was writing about a supernatural investigator. About 2/3 through the story, the narrator is listing all the greatest horrors he had seen. The list ended. I once saw an English teacher named Mr. My name slough off his skin and devour a classroom of students. It was a great surprise and story. I love that he was so considerate of his audience. Reminds me of Bruce Coville's short story about a teacher. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. It still creeps me out because it's got a The Ring sort of deal to it. I forget the name of the story, but it's the last one in the anthology, oddly enough. I was wrong. I swore it was Bruce Coville from Oddly Enough, but it's Karen Jordan Allen in A Nightmare's Dozen. The short story is called Mrs. Pomeroy. My teacher is an alien. My teacher fried my brains. Both are Bruce Coville. No, it's the one about the strict old teacher who slaps her ruler on problem students' desks and they disappear. When they reappear, they are horrified and no longer cause any issues at all. Then one day the narrator gets disappeared and he turns into her while disappeared. Oh man, freaky. I don't think I've read that one. I had a student who was obsessed with silverback gorillas. I mean, everything he wrote was about silverbacks. Even further, most random question. For example, about Shakespeare's sonnets. And his answer would somehow quite logically twist around to his gorillas. After a while he added a character, the Queen of Zanzibar. She controlled this wild and often violent band of gorillas. At the end of that year, I ended up moving away, and at my farewell lunch he gave me a card which says there will never be another story about the silverback gorillas of Zanzibar because the Queen of Zanzibar is moving to Australia. Blew me away. I never thought his stories were analogies of our school/students, or that I had made that much of an impact on his life. Humbling. This makes me laugh. I used to have an obsession with bees, and I would do stuff like this as a kid. When my nephew was 6 or 7 or so, they had to write a description of how to make a sandwich. My nephew proceeded to write a detailed account of how to make a sandwich, which includes getting a mold of a witch and putting wet sand into it. You get the idea. The teacher said in all her years of teaching that no kid had ever done that. She asked to keep a copy because she thought it was so funny. I love it. Give a high five to your nephew for me, please. I pictured Op coming into their 30-year-old nephew's accounting job, giving him a high five, saying something like, "I loved your sandwich story. Good stuff, little buddy," and then just leaving. Yes, please. I had a second language learner who wrote about the death of a close relative. He talked about feelings of extreme sadness, and then said, "I have come to know that this feeling is called grief. It was the most heartbreaking thing I've ever read." Edit. Thank you for the silver, kind stranger. My first award. It is so sad. Teaching middle school. Gave an About Me essay early in the year. One student wrote about how they had a rough home life, parents divorcing, etc. It was very well written and heartbreaking until the last paragraph where he talked about finding religion in the past year. I've learned not to judge people who do wrong, because only God can judge, and they will burn. Either way, you got a paladin on your hands. Question is broken or not. One of my kids got a writing assignment to write a new ending to a story. It was a classic star-crossed lovers narrative, so I figured they'd do a happily ever after. Nope, the female protagonist ended up using the dude for his knight status to escape the thumb of her father, then killed him and went out on her own. When I was a kid, we had a similar prompt given to us in our English class in high school. We were told to write a short story inspired by Romeo and Juliet with a twist. We had to then read our story to the class the following day. This is a summary of a story that one kid in our class wrote. The story started with a family grieving over the loss of Juliet, a woman who had taken her own life by jumping out of a tower after learning of the death of her dear Romeo. Then we flash back a week earlier to when the family discovers that Juliet is pregnant. She had been previously locked away in her tower since last month for seeing Romeo, a poor boy from a poor family. Juliet's family had locked her up and had a guard standing by the door to make sure Romeo couldn't get in to see her. Every day that her father had come to see her, He had noticed that she was always scared and crying. The father assumed she was upset over her pregnancy. The father knew that Romeo was the one that got her pregnant, that he must have got into the tower somehow. Romeo would pay for getting his daughter pregnant and making her cry. The father assumed that Romeo was scaling the tower and entering through the window, since there was a guard at the door. The father decided to spread the news of Juliet's pregnancy to coax Romeo out, so he could catch him in the act. That night the father hid in the bushes. Sure enough, Romeo showed up. Romeo tried to speak with Juliet, but she didn't respond to him or even come to the window. The father showed himself to Romeo and began beating him. Eventually, the father stabbed Romeo repeatedly in the stomach, killing him. This was revenge for getting his daughter pregnant. The father came to see his daughter the next day to tell her the news of Romeo's death. Juliet was distraught and began screaming at her father. The father grew furious that she still cared for Romeo even after he got her pregnant. The father left his daughter and slammed the door to her chambers. He told the guard that she still couldn't leave the tower as punishment for loving Romeo and getting pregnant. A few minutes after the father had left, the guard opened the door and came inside to speak with Juliet. She was terrified and recoiled when he came closer. She scrambled to get away from him. The guard grabbed Juliet and pulled her towards the window. Juliet cried and begged him to stop. The guard ignored her and pushed her out of the window. The only thing he said was, "Sorry, I'm not ready to be a father yet." It turns out that the guard had been raping Juliet every night since she had been locked up in the tower last month. The teacher and the whole class were all slack-jawed. One guy in the class just said, "Holy F dude." I remember the teacher asking the kid who wrote the story to step outside so she could speak privately with him. The class immediately began whispering among themselves while we watched the two of them talk through the window. The kid looked annoyed. He clearly disagreed with what the teacher was saying. Eventually, he walked off and the teacher returned to class. All she said was, "So and so is going to speak with the guidance counselor." Everyone unanimously agreed that the teacher's decision was bullshit and a complete overreaction on her part. But she insisted that he must be a troubled individual to come up with a twist that dark. I remember the next time we had that class, someone asked the kid what happened. It turns out that the guidance counselor agreed that the teacher overreacted and that writing a dark ending to a story doesn't mean someone is a troubled individual. I can sympathize with the teacher in that scenario to a certain extent. I used to teach, and I can imagine they mainly did that just to cover their own ass. The student didn't actually get in trouble, but the teacher doesn't have to feel responsible for not doing anything had that student actually been making a cry for help. Not saying I would reacted the same way, but I get it. I'm not sure that taking the kid outside the classroom immediately after the end of the story was the right choice though. She made it really obvious to the entire class that she thought something was wrong with the kid. If you really think a kid is struggling with some really dark s, wait until after class and ask to talk to them in private. You can still send them to the guidance counselor without letting the whole class know you think they're in need of mental health help. Basically, don't make it public knowledge that you suspect terrible s is going on unless it's something that puts someone in danger at that moment. For an example of time when it's okay to tell a kid to go to the guidance counselor. When I was in middle school, a girl started cutting herself in class and pierced her lip with a safety pin. That's a sign that immediate action is needed. But a story written for an assignment is not that. Totally agree. That's why I said I wouldn't have done what the teacher did. But I can at least sympathize as to why she did it. I taught in English 101 where I had a very open-ended writing assignment to gauge where the students were. It was a long time ago. But if I remember correctly, it was to write about something that happened in your life that was memorable. Like I said, very vague. One student wrote about how his friend had run away from home and asked to stay in his treehouse. Okay, mild enough. Then it turned pretty dark when the student wrote that he was woken up by fire sirens, only to find the treehouse was completely engulfed in flames. Of course no one realized it was occupied. That was 25 years ago, and I still remember the chill I got when I read it. So did his friend die? According to that student, yes. My wife taught high school English, 9th and 10th grade, in California for 10 years. We are both literature majors, and so she'd often let me grade some of her papers. The amount of disclosure of being abused/raped/suicidal was, holy sh. I was a 10th grade teacher and had to report child abuse. It was so hard. The kid was mad at me because he had confided in me, but I obviously have to report that. I only taught that 1 year. I had a student die over the summer joyriding in a stolen car. 4 pregnant girls in my 5th period class. Multiple students who would miss class because they had a court date for some reason or another, usually a child abuse case. It sucked. When I was in high school I wrote about my sexual abuse, hoping so fervently that the teacher would ask or help. Nada. Pretty sure I got an A though. I'm so sorry. A student once wrote a story under the assigned heading of All That Glitters Is Not Gold. It was a first-person narration told as a comedy about a mother telling her daughter on her 21st birthday about the night she brought her home from the hospital. The twist was that the mother was talking to herself in what was due to be the child's bedroom. Her child had actually died the night they brought her home. This floored me. Wow. That is dark AF. He was 15 too. Wonder if he still writes. Really kind of annoying kid. Good person, but too much charisma and used it to goof off during class. Regularly pulled 70s as a result of not paying attention. Held a poetry workshop he opted into. Wrote a poem about his dead parents. I knew he lived with grandma, but not why. The last line was I laugh, so I don't cry shattered my heart. I teach high school maths, so the opportunities for stories are more limited. I set an extended assignment on mathematically evaluating what would happen in a zombie outbreak, looking at what happens to the human population based on how fast zombies can turn them, if there's a cure, if zombies can raise the dead from graves, etc. The last part of the assignment was to model a zombie situation of your choice, come up with some survival strategies, and show mathematically how they helped humans. Most students picked a pop culture zombie style and used that as their inspiration. No problems. At the time, there was a big election going on, so one student decided that anyone under the sway of a particular political party must be a mindless zombie, and recreated the events of the entire election in his mathematical equations. It was a fantastic spin on it that made marking much more fun. Was that teacher Mr. Jessup? I worked at a bookstore that had a spooky story contest for Halloween, and I had to read a lot of stories by elementary students. They were stories by elementary students, but there was this one. On the first pass I guess I didn't like it, but when it came back from another reviewer I happened to read it again. The plot wasn't astounding. It was actually kind of a bad story as far as that goes. What was amazing was that the student changed her vernacular depending on whether the speech was spoken by a character or part of the narration. This is not elementary stuff. It was really incredible and such a small thing that I was so surprised that I even noticed it. It is literally a technique that was considered groundbreaking when Zora Neale Hurston did it, and she's one of the greatest American writers ever. There's no way this little 4th grade girl knew about Hurston. She was just doing it naturally. I was blown away. I tried my best to advocate for that story, even suggested a special prize my boss would not give. I hope that little girl is still writing. I was working in a pre-K classroom while the teacher was reading some stories the kids had dictated to her based on a collection of drawings. One child had a story called Empire State Building that she was about to read while I was organizing the refrigerator. The story went, there's a tornado, all of the people are dead. I had to keep my head buried in the fridge as I was red in the face from trying not to howl with laughter at the most amazing story hook a 4-year-old ever wrote. I took pictures, but really wish I had kept that story.